time for revolution. The American Revolution has begun. Good morning, YouTube. Today is the day after the 250th year, the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. The shot heard around the world was fired yesterday. And 250 years ago, when that happened, Philadelphia was a hotbed of political activity. News of that shot wouldn't reach the city for 5 days, but when it did, it completely changed the trajectory of politics in this city. Now, you have to realize that in Boston, British antagonism had already put the city on edge. You know, when I lived there, I would walk around and see the monuments on the Dorchester Heights. So it was called, those hills, and Bunker Hill. And all of that's to come. And in this series, I want to tell the story of the revolution from the perspective of Philadelphia. But a lot of that, the revolution takes place in Boston. So we'll do a little bit of Boston history too. Now, Lexington and Concord happened months after the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party is really where tensions became, they sort of boiled over into action, for dramatic action for one of the first times. Essentially, the British had imposed tariffs and taxation on the colonies in an effort to control them. And the colonies didn't like that. It was unfair. I won't go into the details too much, but suffice to say that the British were overcharging for their goods. They put tariffs on, which amounts to a tax. And it was a very small tariff. It was a 2%, something like that, just a couple of percent. But that was enough for the colonists to realize that they needed to boycott the British economically in order to stand up for themselves. And in response, the British imposed essentially martial law in Massachusetts in response to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was a bunch of bandits who were loyalists, budding American patriots, and they boarded a ship very peacefully. Rumors were that they were dressed as Native Americans, which was symbolic. And they pushed about 90 tons of tea into the sea. And when the British Crown heard about this, they decided that they were losing control of the colonies, and they imposed martial law in Massachusetts. They removed self-rule and disbanded local governments. And in response to this, the colonists obviously weren't going to have that. But what happened in terms of military action was that the British began seizing control of guns, ammunition, and cannons from military storehouses across Massachusetts and New England. And it sort of became a race in New England between colonial militias and New England and British troops to seize the guns that had been stored in various government houses around Massachusetts. In fact, one of the myths of Lexington and Concord or misconceptions, I guess you could say, is that it was the first shot of the revolution. And that might not technically be true, because there were previous skirmishes. There weren't full-out battles yet, but little conflicts over these storehouses of ammunition and guns. And at one previous a precursor event to Lexington and Concord. There was a storehouse somewhere in Massachusetts, and a shot was fired at that confrontation. So technically, that was the first shot of the revolution. And then in the weeks after, Lexington and Concord happened. Another thing to note is that when Lexington and Concord happened, there wasn't a clear notion in Philadelphia yet about whether the next move was to make peace and try to integrate with the British and sort of acquiesce to British demands in order to avoid war, or if it was time to begin mobilizing a continental army and forming militias to fight back against the British and to seek independence for the colonies. This was an open debate, and the first Continental Congress that met in Philadelphia in the months before Lexington and Concord, this had been, they couldn't really make a decision. I think I haven't read up on the First Continental Congress in detail, so someone with more of a historic, more background in that event, please correct me, but my understanding is that the Continental Congress, the first one, met and sort of outlined the debate, but didn't reach a conclusion about what exactly to do. Of course, after the Battle of Concord, it became very clear what the colonists had to do. And the next step was clearly to make moves to establish control over New England and form a revolutionary army, which became known as the Continental Army. And the Battle of Concord, when news of that reached Philadelphia, it happened about a week or two, maybe even less. I want to say maybe more like, about 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks before the Second Continental Congress met. And it was at the Second Continental Congress that it became very clear across America that we were now at war and that the revolution had begun. It was at that Congress that the Continental Army formed, and it was at that Congress that at that congressional meeting that the Continental Congress commissioned George Washington to form the Continental Army. And that meeting happened right here in Carpenter Hall. Okay, quick correction. Obviously, I made a mistake. The first Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, because at that time, they weren't really clear what they were doing yet. Was this a revolutionary war? Not according to the colonists. Many of the colonists considered themselves British. I mean, they were British. And they they were loyal to the king. They wanted to continue their way of life as British citizens. So in another tidbit about this whole story is, the famous line of, the British are coming, the British are coming. That really wasn't said. Maybe a year after Lexington and Concord, or months after, that would have made more sense to say, when it became clear that American identity that formed here at Carpenter's Hall was separate from British identity. But when the First Continental Congress met here in Philadelphia, that identity had not yet separated for the rest of the colonies. Everyone considered themselves British. And so saying the British are coming didn't quite make sense. Instead, they probably said something like, the regulars are coming. The regulars are coming, meaning the regular army. So just a tidbit. But the Second Continental Congress obviously met at Independence Hall. And it's there that Washington got his commission and the Continental Army formed. And it was at that moment that the American Revolution, which, again, because they were British, was a civil war in the British Empire. It was only later that we realized we were forming a new country and called it the Revolutionary War. That's where the war began. This is the first bank, Hamilton's Bank. And over here is Independence Hall. And I'm walking down these streets of Philadelphia when Lexington and Concord, when the news of that battle hit this area, you have to imagine bells were ringing across the city. The bells in Independence Hall rang. The local church bells were ringing. People poured out onto the streets and began discussing what they were going to do. What should we do? Should we set up mutual defense groups, community defense groups? And they set up little committees, local committees, that began to form a shadow government to resist the British government, which again had imposed a martial law in Massachusetts and the colonies. And militias began forming in the streets of Philadelphia. They began marching and doing drills. And by the time the Second Continental Congress met, the infrastructure to build the army and to build the Revolutionary War movement as a political entity that could actually implement self-rule in the colonies and defend itself against foreign adversaries was in place. And it became a reality directly as a result of Lexington and Concord. And one of the people who was instrumental in that formation was Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia's very own patron saint, I would say. other than Tamanend, I think Benjamin Franklin gets my vote as my favorite Philadelphian for sure. And he had recently returned just before the Second Continental Congress met right here in Independence Hall. He had come back from living in Britain for 10 years, trying to negotiate with the British to stand up for the colonial rights and colonial freedoms. And he was very well respected in Britain. But when the Boston Tea Party happened, the British Parliament decided that it would be important to kneecap the political representatives of the colonies in the Parliament over in Britain. So there was this famous situation where the British Parliament had this hours-long roast of Ben Franklin, where they basically took him to task and said all sorts of mean and nasty things about him. And he just sort of sat there silently laughing as they said ridiculous things to try to do a character assassination of this great man, Benjamin Franklin. And at that point, it became clear to him that he was not going to win favor in Parliament for colonial independence and self-rule, and that his time in Britain was up. So he came back to the colonies, and he arrived in the days after Lexington and Concord happened, and about 5 days before the Second Continental Congress. His timing couldn't have been better. And so when he arrived the question about whether to make peace with the British, which had been the major concern of the First Continental Congress over in Carpenter's Hall, was answered. And Ben Franklin had the answer. The answer was that the British were not going to play ball with the colonies. There was no more time for reconciliation or half measures, or there was no interest on the British part for allowing their subjects to remain independent in the colonies. They wanted to crush American liberty, which was clearly getting out of their control. And Benjamin Franklin was able to make that argument at the Second Continental Congress 5 days after he got back, and about 2 weeks after Lexington and Concord. There's the Liberty Bell. Yeah. So, Lexington and Concord has happened. In the coming weeks, the Second Continental Congress happens. And so begins the American Revolution. That is the basic story of how this all started. And I'm going to cover, whatever bits and pieces of this story I can. And maybe by the end of this series, we'll have a coherent story of the American Revolution, as I tell it. And this is basically part 1. This is the first episode. We'll see. I'm going to try to do a whole series over the next year or so as we celebrate the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country. And I hope you come along, because it's a very interesting story. It's very important to the history of the world. America's a special place. The American Revolution was a special revolution. And it directly inspired the French Revolution, which one could argue is, which had more impact in the history of the world, the French Revolution or the American Revolution. But certainly when the French Revolution happened, they looked to America for inspiration and for lessons learned. And so I'm going to tell this story as a native Philadelphian, born and raised here. And I hope you come along. So thanks. My name's Sean. This is my channel, Saul Good. And welcome to the American Revolution.